Welcome back to The Mark of Zorro, Part 7 by Johnston McCulley. El final de la historia del Zorro. Vámonos, mi amigos. Senor Zorro stood like a statue in the native's hut, one hand grasping his horse's muzzle, the native crouched at his side. Down the highway came the drumming of horses' hoofs. The pursuit swept by, the men calling to one another and cursing the darkness as they rushed down the valley. Senor Zorro opened the door and glanced out, listened for a moment, and then led out his horse. He tendered the native a coin. "Not from you, senor," the native said. "Take it. You have need of it, and I have not," the highwayman said. He vaulted into the saddle and turned his horse up the steep slope of the hill behind the hut. The animal made little noise as it climbed to the summit. Senor Zorro descended into the small depression on the other side and came to a narrow trail, and along this he rode at a slow gallop, stopping his mount now and then to listen for sounds of other horsemen who might be abroad. He rode toward Reina de los Angeles, but he appeared to be in no hurry about arriving at the pueblo. Senor Zorro had another adventure planned for this night, and it had to be accomplished at a certain time and under certain conditions. It was 2 hours later when he came to the crest of the hill above the town. He sat quietly in the saddle for some time, regarding the scene. The moonlight was fitful now, but now and then he could make out the plaza. He saw no troopers, heard nothing of them, decided that they had ridden back in pursuit of him, and that those who had been sent in pursuit of Don Carlos and Donna Catalina had not yet returned. In the tavern there were lights, and in the Presidio and in the house where His Excellency was a guest. Senor Zorro waited until it was dark, and then urged his horse forward slowly, but off the main highway. He circled the pueblo, and in time approached the Presidio from the rear. He dismounted now and led his horse, going forward slowly, often stopping to listen, for this was a very ticklish business and might end in disaster if a mistake were made. He stopped his horse behind the Presidio, where the wall of the building would cast a shadow if the moon came from behind the clouds again, and he went forward cautiously, following the wall as he had done on the other night. When he came to the office window, he peered inside. Captain Ramon was there, alone, looking over some reports spread out on the table before him, evidently awaiting the return of his men. Senor Zorro crept to the corner of the building and found that there was no guard. He had guessed and hoped that the Commandante had sent every available man to the chase, but he knew that he'd have to act quickly, for some of the troopers might return. He slipped through the door and crossed the big lounging room, and so came to the door of the office. His pistol was in hand, and could a man have seen behind the mask, he would observe Senor Zorro's lips were crushed in a thin, straight line of determination. As upon that other night, Captain Ramon whirled around his chair when he heard the door open behind him, and once more he saw the eyes of Senor Zorro glittering through his mask, and he saw the muzzle of the pistol menacing him. "Not a move, not a sound. It would give me pleasure to fill your body with hot lead," Senor Zorro said. "You're alone. Your silly troopers are chasing me where I am not." "By the saints," Captain Ramon breathed. "Not so much as a whisper, senor, if you hope to live. Turn your back to me." "You would murder me?" "I am not that sort, Commandante, and I said for you not to make a sound. Put your hands behind your back, for I'm going to bind your wrists." Captain Ramon complied. Senor Zorro stepped forward swiftly and bound the wrists with his own sash, which he tore from his waist, and then he whirled Captain Ramon around so that he could face him. "Where's His Excellency?" he asked. "At Don Estado's house." "I knew as much, but wanted to see whether you prefer to speak the truth tonight. It is well if you do so. We're going to call upon the governor." "To call?" "Yes, upon His Excellency," I said, "and do not speak again. Come with me." He grasped Captain Ramon by the arm and hurried him from the office across the lounging room out the door. He plodded him around the building to where his horse was waiting. "Mount," he commanded. "I shall sit behind you with the muzzle of this pistol at the base of your brain. Make no mistake, Commandante, unless you are tired of life, I'm determined man this night. Captain Ramon had observed it. He mounted as he was directed, and the highwayman mounted behind him and held the reins with one hand, the pistol in the other. Captain Ramon could feel the touch of the cold steel at the back of his head. Senor Zorro guided his horse with his knees instead of his reins. He urged the beast down the slope and circled the town once more, keeping away from the beaten trails, and so approached the rear of the house where His Excellency was a guest. Here was the difficult part of the adventure. He wanted to get Captain Ramon before the governor, to talk to both of them, and to do it without having anybody else interfere. He forced the captain to dismount and led him to the rear wall of the house. There was a patio there, and they entered it. It appeared that Senor Zorro knew the interior of the house well. He entered it through a servant's room, taking Captain Ramon with him, and passed through a hall without awakening the sleeping native. They went along the hall slowly. From one room came the sound of snoring. From beneath the door of another a light streamed out. Senor Zorro stopped before that door and applied an eye to the crack at the side of it. If Captain Ramon harbored thoughts of voicing alarm or offering battle, the touch of the pistol at the back of his head caused him to forget them. And he'd scant time to think of a way out of his predicament, for suddenly Senor Zorro threw open the door, hurled Captain Ramon through it, followed himself, and shut the door quickly behind him. In the room there was His Excellency and his host. "Silence, and do not move," Senor Zorro said. "The slightest alarm, and I'll put a pistol ball through the governor's head. That is understood?" "Very well, senors." "Senor Zorro," the governor gasped. "The same, Your Excellency. I ask your host to be not frightened, for I mean him no harm if he sits quietly until I am done." "Captain Ramon, kindly sit across the table from the governor. I'm delighted to find the head of the state awake and waiting news from those who are chasing me. His brain will be clear, and he can understand better what is said." "What means this outrage?" the governor exclaimed. "Captain Ramon, how comes this? Seize this man. You're an officer." "Do not blame the Commandante," Senor Zorro said. "He knows it is death to make a move. There's little matter that needs explanation, and since I cannot come to you in a broad day as a man should, I'm forced to adopt this method. Make yourselves comfortable, senores. This may take some little time." His Excellency fidgeted in his chair. "You have this day insulted a family of good blood, Your Excellency," Senor Zorro went on. "You have forgotten the proprieties to such an extent that you have ordered thrown into your miserable carcel a hidalgo and his gentle wife and innocent daughter. You've taken such means to gratify spite." "They were traitors," His Excellency shouted. What have they done of treason?" "You're an outlaw with a price upon your head. They have been guilty of harboring you and giving you aid." "Where got you this information?" "Captain Ramon has an abundance of evidence." "Ah, the Commandante, eh? We shall see about that. Captain Ramon is present, and we can get at the truth. May I ask the nature of your evidence?" "You're at the Pulido Hacienda," the governor said. "I admit it." "Natives saw you and carried word to the Presidio. The soldiers hurried out to effect your capture." "A moment. Who said a native sounded the alarm?" "Captain Ramon assured me so." "Here's the first chance for the captain to speak the truth as a matter of fact. Commandante, was it not Don Carlos Pulido himself who sent the native?" "The truth." "It was a native who brought word." "And he did not tell your sergeant that Don Carlos had sent him? Did he not say that Don Carlos had slipped him the information in whispers while he was carrying his fainting wife to the other room? Is it not true that Don Carlos did his best to hold me at his hacienda until the soldiers arrived that I might be captured? Did not Don Carlos thus try to show his loyalty to the governor?" "By the saints, Ramon, you never told me as much," His Excellency cried. They're traitors, the captain declared stubbornly. What other evidence? Senor Zorro asked. Why, when the soldiers arrived, you concealed yourself by some trick, the governor said. And presently Captain Ramon himself reached the scene, and while he was there, you crept from a closet, ran him through treacherously from behind, and made your escape. It is an evident fact that Don Carlos had hidden you in the closet. By the saints, Senor Zorro swore, I had thought, Captain Ramon, that you're a man enough to admit defeat, though I knew you for a scoundrel and other things. Tell the truth. That is the truth. Tell the truth, Senor Zorro commanded, stepping closer to him and bringing up the pistol. I came from the closet and spoke to you. I gave you time to draw your blade and to get on guard. We fenced for fully 10 minutes, did we not? I admit freely that for a moment you puzzled me, and then I solved your method by giving battle and knew you were at my mercy, and then, when I could have slain you easily, but I scratched your shoulder. Is that not the truth? Answer as you hope to live. Captain Ramon licked his dry lips and could not meet the governor's eyes. Answer, Senor Zorro thundered. It is the truth, the captain acknowledged. Ha! So I ran you through from behind, eh? It's an insult to my blade to have it enter your body. You see, Your Excellency, what manner of a man you have for a comandante here. Is there no more evidence? There is, the governor said. When the Pulidos were guests at the house of Don Diego Vega, and Don Diego was away, Captain Ramon went to pay his respects and found you there alone with the senorita. And that shows what? That you are in league with the Pulidos, that they harbored you even in the house of Don Diego, a loyal man, and when the captain discovered you there, the senorita flung herself upon him and held him, delayed him, rather until you made your escape through a window. Is that not enough? So that is the tale he told, eh? The highwayman said. As a matter of fact, Captain Ramon is enamored of the senorita. He went to the house, found her alone, forced his attentions upon her, even told her that she should not object since her father was held in the bad graces of the governor. He attempted to caress her, and she called for help. I responded. How did you happen to be there? I do not care to answer that, but I take my oath the senorita did not know of my presence. She called for aid. I responded. I made this thing you call a comandante kneel before her and apologize, and then I took him to the door and kicked him out into the dust, and afterward I visited him at the Presidio and told him that he had given insult to a noble senorita. It appears that you hold some love for her yourself, the governor said. I do, Your Excellency, and I'm proud to admit it. Ha! You condemned her and her parents by that statement. You deny now that they are in league with you? I do. Her parents do not know of our love. This senorita is scarcely conventional. Senor, governor, or no. Another thought like that, and I spill your blood, Senor Zorro said. I've told you what happened that night at the house of Don Diego Vega. Captain Ramon will testify that what I have said is the exact truth. Is it not, Commandante? Answer. It is the truth, the captain gulped, looking at the muzzle of the highwayman's pistol. Then you've told me a falsehood, and can no longer be an officer of mine, the governor cried. It appears that this highwayman can do as he pleases with you. Ha! But I still believe that Don Carlos Pulido is a traitor and the member of his family, and it has availed you nothing, Senor Zorro, to play this little scene. My soldiers shall continue to pursue them, and you, and before they are done, I'll have the Pulidos dragged in the dirt, and I'll have you stretching a rope with your carcass. Quite a bold speech, observed Senor Zorro. You set your soldiers a pretty task, Your Excellency. I rescued your 3 prisoners tonight, and they have escaped. They shall be retaken. Time alone will tell that, and now I have another duty to perform here, Your Excellency. You will take your chair to the far corner and sit there, and your host will sit beside you, and there you shall remain until I've finished." "What do you mean to do?" "Obey me," Senor Zorro cried. "I've scant time for argument, even with the governor." He watched while the two chairs were placed and the governor and his host had seated themselves, and then he stepped nearer to Captain Ramon. "You insulted a pure and innocent girl, Comandante," he said. "For that you shall fight. Your scratched shoulder is healed now, and you wear your blade by your side. Such a man as you is not fit to breathe God's pure air. The country is better for your absence. On your feet, senor, and on guard." Captain Ramon was white with rage. He knew that he was ruined. He had been forced to confess that he lied, and he'd heard the governor remove his rank, and this man before him had been the cause of all of it. Perhaps in his anger he could kill this Senor Zorro, stretch this curse of Capistrano on the floor with his life's blood flowing away. Perhaps if he did that, His Excellency would relent. He sprang from his chair and backward toward the governor. "Unfasten my wrists," he cried. "Let me at this dog." "You're as good as dead before." "You certainly are dead after using that word," Senor Zorro said calmly. The Commandante's wrists were untied. He whipped out his blade, sprang forward with a cry, and launched himself in a furious attack on the highwayman. Senor Zorro gave ground before this onslaught, and so obtained a position where the light from the candelero did not bother his eyes. He was skilled with a blade, and had fenced for life many times, and he knew the danger in the attack of an angered man who did not fence according to the code. He knew, too, that such anger is spent quickly unless a fortunate thrust makes the possessor of it victor almost at once. And so he retreated step by step, guarding well, parrying vicious strokes, alert for any unexpected move. The governor and his host were sitting in the corner, but bending forward and watching the combat. "Run him through, Ramon, and I reinstate and promote you," His Excellency cried. The Commandante thus urged to do it. Senor Zorro found his opponent fighting much better than he had before in Don Carlos Pulido's house at the hacienda. He found himself forced to fight out of a dangerous corner, and the pistol he held in his left hand to intimidate the governor and his host bothered him. And suddenly he tossed it on the table and then swung around so that neither of the two men could dart from the corner and get it without running the chance of receiving a blade between the ribs. And there he stood his ground to fight. Captain Ramon could not force him to give way now. His blade seemed to be a score. It darted in and out, trying to find a resting place in the captain's body. The Senor Zorro was eager to have an end of this and be gone. He knew that dawn was not far away, and he feared that some trooper might come to the house with a report for the governor. "Fight, insulter of girls," he cried. "Fight, man who tells a falsehood to injure a noble family. Fight, coward and poltroon. Now death stares you in the face, and soon you'll be claimed. Ha! I almost had you then. Fight, cur!" Captain Ramon cursed and charged, but Senor Zorro received him and drove him back, and so held his position. The perspiration was standing out on the captain's forehead in great globules. His breath was coming heavily from between his parted lips. His eyes were bright and bulging. "Fight, weakling," the highwayman taunted him. "This time I am not attacking from behind. If you have prayers to say them, for your time grows short." The ringing blades, the shifting of feet on the floor, and the heavy breathing of the combatants and of the two spectators of this life and death struggle were only sounds in the room. His Excellency sat far forward in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of it so that his knuckles were white. "Kill me this highwayman," he shrieked. "Use your good skill, Ramon. At him." Captain Ramon rushed again, calling into play his last bit of strength, fencing with what skill he could command. His arms were as lead, his breath was fast. He thrust and lunged and made a mistake of a fraction of an inch. Like the tongue of a serpent, Senor Zorro's blade shot in. Thrice it darted forward, Upon the fair brow of Ramon, just between the eyes, there flamed suddenly a red, bloody letter Z, the mark of Zorro. The highwayman cried, "You will wear it forever now, Commandante." Senor Zorro's face became more stern. His blade shot in again and came out dripping red. The Commandante gasped and slipped to the floor. "You've slain him," the governor cried. "You've taken his life, wretch." "Ah, I trust so. The thrust was through the heart, Excellency. He never will insult the senorita again." Senor Zorro looked down at his fallen foe, regarded the governor a moment, then wiped his blade on the sash that he had bound the Commandante's wrist with. He returned the blade to its scabbard, picked up his pistol from the table. "My night's work is done," he said. "And you shall hang for it," His Excellency cried. "Perhaps when you catch me," replied the curse of Capistrano, bowing ceremoniously. Then, without glancing again at the twitching body of him who had been Captain Ramon, he whirled through the door and was in the hall and rushed through it to the patio to his horse. And he rushed into danger. The dawn had come. The first pink streaks had appeared in the eastern sky, and then the sun had risen quickly above the heights to the east, and now the plaza was bathed in brilliance. There was no mist, no high fog even, and objects on the hillside far away stood out in relief. It was no morning in which to ride for life and freedom. Senor Zorro had delayed too long with the governor and commandante, else he had misjudged the hour. He swung into his saddle and urged his beasts out of the patio, and then a full realization of his imminent peril came to him. Down the trail from San Gabriel came Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez and his troopers. Down the Pala road came another detachment of soldiers that had been trailing the Caballeros and Don Carlos and had given up in disgust. Over the hill toward the Presidio came the third body of men who had been in chase of those who had rescued Donna Catalina. Senor Zorro himself found himself hemmed in by his foes. The curse of Capistrano deliberately stopped his horse and for a moment contemplated the outlook. He glanced at the three bodies of troopers, estimated the distance, and in that instant one with Sergeant Gonzalo's detachment saw him and raised the alarm. They knew that magnificent horse, that long purple cloak and black mask and wide sombrero. They saw before him the man that had been pursuing through the night, the man who had made fools of them and played with them about the hills and valleys. They feared the rage of His Excellency and their superior officers, and in the hearts and minds was a determination to capture or slay this curse of Capistrano now, as this last chance was offered to him. Senor Zorro put spurs to his horse and dashed across the plaza, in full view of some score of citizens. Just as he did that, the governor and his host rushed from the house, shrieking that Senor Zorro was a murderer and should be taken. Natives scurried like so many mice for shelter, and men of rank stood and gaped in astonishment. Senor Zorro, having crossed the plaza, drove his horse at the highest speed straight toward the highway. Sergeant Gonzalez and his troopers rushed to cut him off and turn him back, shrieking at one another, pistols in their hands, blades loosened in their scabbard. Reward and promotion and the satisfaction were to be their lot if they made an end of the highwayman right here and now. Senor Zorro was forced to swerve from his first course. He saw that he could not win through. He had not taken his pistol from his belt, but he had drawn his blade, and it dangled from his right wrist in such a fashion that he could grip the hilt of it instantly and put it into play. He cut across the plaza again, almost running down several men of rank who were in the way, passed within a few paces of the infuriated governor and his host, and darted between two houses and rushed toward the hills in that direction. It appeared that he had some small chance of escaping the cordon of his foes now. He scorned paths and trails and cut across the open ground. From both sides, the troopers galloped to meet him, flying toward the angle of the wedge, hoping to reach it in time and turn him back once more. Gonzales was shouting orders in his great voice, and he was sending a part of his men down into the pueblos so they could be in proper position in case the highwayman turned back again and could keep him from escaping to the west. He reached the highway and started down it toward the path to the south. It was not the direction he would have preferred, but he had no choice now. He dashed around the curve in the road where some of the natives' huts cut off the view and suddenly pulled up his horse, almost unseating himself. For here a new menace presented itself. Straight at him along the highway flew a horse and rider, and close behind came half a dozen troopers in pursuit. Senor Zorro whirled his horse. He could not turn to the right because of the stone fence. His horse could have jumped it, but on the other side was soft plowed ground. He knew he could make no progress across it, and that the troopers might cut him off or cut him down with a pistol bullet. Nor could he turn to the left, for there was a sheer precipice down which he could not hope to ride with safety. He had to turn back toward Sergeant Gonzales and the men who rode with him, hoping to get a distance of a couple of 100 yards where he could make a descent before Gonzales and his men arrived at the spot. He gripped his sword now and was prepared for a fight, for he knew it was going to be a close work. He glanced back over his shoulder and gasped his surprise, for it was Señorita Lolita Pulido who rode that horse and was pursued by half a dozen troopers. And he had thought her safe at the hacienda of Fray Felipe. Her long black hair was down and streaming out behind her. Her tiny heels were glued to the horse's flanks. She bent forward as she rode, holding the reins low down, and Señor Zorro, even at that instant, marveled at her skill with the mount. "Señor," he heard her shout, and then she had reached his side, and they rode together, dashing down upon Gonzales and his troopers. "They've been chasing me for hours," she gasped. "I escaped them at Fray Felipe's." "Ride close. Do not waste breath," he screeched. "My horse is almost done, señor." Señor Zorro glanced aside at the beast, and he saw that he was suffering from fatigue, but there was scant time to consider that now. The soldiers behind them had gained some. Those in front presented a lively menace that required deep consideration. Down the trail they flew side by side, straight at Gonzales and his men. Señor Zorro could see the pistols were out, and he doubted not that the governor had given orders to get him dead or alive. But to see that, he did not escape again. Now he spurred a few paces in advance of the señorita and called upon her to ride in his horse's track. He dropped the reins on his mount's neck and held his blade ready. He had two weapons, his blade and his horse. Then came the crash. Señor Zorro swerved his horse at the proper instant, and the señorita followed him. He cut at a trooper on his left, swung over, and cut at the one on his right. His horse crashed into that third of a trooper and hurled it against the animal the sergeant rode. He heard shrill cries about him. He knew the men who had been pursuing Señorita Lolita had run into others, and that he was certain, in that amount of confusion, that they could not use blades for fear of cutting down each other. And then he was through them. With the señorita riding at his side again, once more he was at the edge of the plaza. His horse was showing signs of weariness, and he had gained nothing. For the way to San Gabriel was not open. The way to Pala was closed. He could not hope to escape by cutting across the soft ground, and on the opposite side of the plaza were more troopers, in the saddle and waiting to cut him off, no matter in which direction he started. "We are caught," he shouted, "but we are not done, señorita." "My horse is stumbling," she cried. Señor Zorro saw that it was so. He knew that the beast could not make another 100 yards. "To the tavern," he cried. They galloped straight across the plaza. At the door of the tavern, the señorita's horse staggered and fell. Señor Zorro caught the girl in his arms in time to save her from a hard fall, and still carrying her, darted through the tavern door. "Out!" he cried to the landlord and the native servant. "Out!" he shrieked to half a dozen loiterers, exhibiting his pistol. They rushed through the door and into the plaza. The highwayman threw the door shut and bolted it. He saw that every window was closed except the one that fronted the plaza, and that the board and skin coverings were in place. He stepped to the table and then whirled to face the señorita. "It may be the end," he said. "Señor, surely the saints will be kind to us." "We are beset by foes, señorita. I care not, so that I die fighting as a caballero should. But you, señorita, they shall never put me in that foul carcel again, señor, I swear it. I would rather die with you." She took the sheepskinner's knife from her bosom, and he caught a glance of it. "Not that, señorita," he cried. "I've given you my heart, señor. Either we live together, or we die together." He darted to the window and glanced out. The troopers were surrounding the building. He could see the governor stalking across the plaza, crying his orders. Down the San Gabriel trail came the proud Don Alejandro Vega to pay his visit to the governor. And he stopped at the plaza's edge and began questioning men regarding the cause of all this tumult. "All are in at the death," Señor Zorro said, laughing. "I wonder where my brave caballeros are, those who rode with me." "You expect their age?" she asked. "Not so, señorita. They would have to stand together and face the governor, tell him their intention. It was a lark with them, and I doubt whether they'll take it seriously enough to stand by me now. It is not to be expected. I fight it out alone." "Not alone, señor, when I am by your side." He clasped her in his arms and pressed her to him. "I would we might have our chance," he said, "but it would be folly for you to let my disaster influence your life. You never have seen my face even, señorita. You could forget me. You could walk from this place and surrender. Send your word to Don Diego Vega that you'll become his bride, and the governor then would be forced to release you and clear your parents of all blame." "Ah, señor, think, señorita. Think what it would mean. His Excellency would not dare stand an instant against Vega. Your parents would have their lands restored. You would be the bride of the richest young man in the country. You would have everything to make you happy." "Everything except love, señor. And without love the rest is naught. Think, señorita, and decide once and for all. You have but a moment now." "I made my decision long ago, señor. A Pulido loves but once, and does not wed where she cannot love." "God!" he cried, and pressed her close again. Now there came a battering at the door. "Señor Zorro!" Sergeant Gonzalez cried. "Well, señor?" Zorro asked. "I have an offer for you from His Excellency the Governor." "I'm listening, loud one." "His Excellency has no wish to cause your death or injury to the señorita you have inside with you. He asks that you open the door and come out with the lady." "To what end?" Señor Zorro asked. "You shall be given a fair trial, and the señorita also. Thus you may escape death and receive your imprisonment instead." "Ha! I've seen samples of His Excellency fair trials," Señor Zorro responded. "Think you that I am an imbecile? His Excellency bids me say that this is the last chance, that the offer will not be renewed. His Excellency is wise not to waste breath renewing it. He grows fat, and his breath is short." "What can you expect to gain by resistance save death?" Gonzalez asked. "How can you hope to offstand 1.5 of us?" "It has been done before, loud one." "We can batter in the door and take you." "After a few of you have been stretched lifeless on the floor," Señor Zorro observed. "Who'll be the first through the door, my sergeant?" "For the last time, come in and drink a mug of wine with me," said the highwayman, laughing. "Meal mush and goat's milk," swore Sergeant Gonzalez. There was Quiet then for a time, and Senor Zorro, glancing through the window cautiously so as not to attract a pistol shot, observed that the governor was in consultation with the sergeant and a certain amount of the troopers. The consultation ended, and Senor Zorro darted back from the window. Almost immediately, the attack on the door began. They were pounding at it with heavy timbers, trying to smash it down. Senor Zorro, standing in the middle of the room, pointed his pistol at the door and fired. And as the ball tore through the wood and somebody outside gave a shriek in pain, he darted to the table and started loading the pistol again. Then he hurried across the door and observed the hole where the bullet had gone through. The plank had been split, and there was quite a crack in it. Senor Zorro put the point of his blade at this crack and waited. Again the heavy timber crashed against the door, and some trooper threw his weight against it also. Senor Zorro's blade darted through the crack like a streak of lightning and came back red, and again there was a shriek outside. And now a volley of pistol balls came through the door, but Senor Zorro, laughing, had sprung back out of harm's way. "Well done," Senorita Lolita cried. "We shall stamp our mark on several of these hounds before we are done," he replied. "I would that I could aid you, senor." "You're doing it, senorita. It is your love that gives me strength." "If I could use a blade—" "Ah, senorita, that is for a man to do. Do you pray that all may be well?" "And at last, senor, if it is seen that there is no hope, may I then see your dear face?" "I swear it, senorita, and feel my arms about you, and my lips on yours. Death will not so bitter then." The attack on the door was renewed. Now pistol shots were coming through it regularly, and through the one open window also, and there was nothing for Senor Zorro to do except stand in the middle of the room and wait, his blade held ready. There'd be a lively few minutes, he promised, when the door was down, and they rushed in. It seemed to be giving way now. The senorita crept close to him, tears streaming down her cheeks, and grasped him by the arm. "You will not forget?" she asked. "I'll not forget, senorita. Just before they break down the door, senor, take me in your arms and let me see your face and kiss me. Then I can die with good grace, too. You must live, not to be sent to a foul carcel, senor. And what would life be without you? Well, there is Don Diego. I think of nobody but you, senor. A Pulido will know how to die, and perhaps my death will bring home to men the perfidy of the governor. Perhaps it may be of service." Again the heavy timber struck against the door. They could hear His Excellency shouting encouragement to the troopers. They could hear the natives shrieking and Sergeant Gonzalez crying his orders in his loud voice. Senor Zorro hurried to the window again, chancing a bullet, and glanced out. He saw that half a dozen troopers had their blades ready and were prepared to rush over the door in the moment it was down. They would get him, but he would get some of them first. Again the ram came against the door. "It is almost the end, senor," the girl whispered. "I know it, senorita. I would we had better fortune, yet I can die gladly, since this love has been in my life. Now, senor, your face and lips, the door is crashing in." She ceased to sob and lifted her face bravely. Senor Zorro sighed, and one hand fumbled with the bottom of his mask. But suddenly there was tumult outside in the plaza, and the battering of the door ceased, and they could hear loud voices that they'd not heard before. Senor Zorro let go of his mask and darted to the window. 23 horsemen were galloping into the plaza. The beasts they rode were magnificent. Their saddles and bridles were heavily chased with silver. Their cloaks were of the finest materials, and they wore hats with plumes, as if this was somewhat of a dress affair, and they wished the world to know it. Each man sat straight and proud in the saddle, his blade at his side, and every blade had a jeweled hilt, being at once serviceable and a rich ornament. They galloped along the face of the tavern, between the door and the soldiers who had been battering it, between the building and the governor and assembled citizens, and they were turned and stood with their horses side by side, facing His Excellency. "Wait, there's a better way," their leader cried. "Ha!" screeched the governor, "I understand. Here we have the young men of all the noble families in the Southland. They have come to show their loyalty by taking this curse of Capistrano. I thank you, caballeros, yet it's not my wish to have any of you slain by this fellow. He's not worthy of your blade, senor. Do you ride to one side and lend the strength of your presence, and let my troopers deal with the rogue? Again, I thank you for this show of loyalty, for this demonstration that you stand for law and order and all it means for constituted authority." "Peace," their leader cried. "Your Excellency, we represent power in this section, do we not?" "You do, caballeros," the governor said. "Our families say who shall rule, what laws shall be termed just, do they not?" "They have great influence," the governor said. "You would not care to stand alone against us?" "Most assuredly not," His Excellency cried, "but I pray you let the troopers get this fellow. It is not seemly that a caballero should suffer a wound or death from his blade." "It is to be regretted that you do not understand." "Understand?" queried the governor in a questioning tone, glancing up and down the line of mounted men. "We have taken counsel with ourselves, Excellency. We know our strength and power, and we have decided upon certain things. There have been things done that we cannot countenance. The frailes of the missions have been despoiled by officials. Natives have been treated worse than dogs. Even men of noble blood have been robbed because they have not been friendly to the ruling powers." "Caballero!" "Peace, Excellency, until I've done. This thing came to crisis when a hidalgo and his wife and daughter were thrown into a carcel by your orders. Such a thing cannot be countenanced, Excellency. And so we have banded ourselves together, and here we take a hand. Be it known that we ourselves rode with Senor Zorro when we invaded the carcel and rescued the prisoners, that we carried Don Carlos and Don Catalina to places of safety, and that we have pledged our words and honors and blades, and that they shall not be persecuted more. I would say, silence until I've done. We stand together, and the strength of our united families is behind us. Call upon your soldiers to attack us if you dare. Every man of noble blood up and down the length of the El Camino Real would flock to our defense, would unseat you from your office, would see you humbled. We await your answer, Excellency." What would you do?" His Excellency gasped. "First, proper consideration for Don Carlos Pulido and his family. No carcel for them. If you have the courage to try them for treason, be sure that will be on hand at the trial, and deal with any man who gives a perjured testimony, and with any magistrado who does not conduct himself properly. We are determined, Excellency." Perhaps I was hasty in the matter, but I was led to believe certain things. The governor said, "I grant you your wish. One side now, caballeros, while my men get this rogue in the tavern." "We're not done," the leader said. "We have things to say regarding this Senor Zorro, what he has done, actually, Excellency. Is he guilty of any treason? He has robbed no man except those who robbed the defenseless first. He has whipped a few unjust persons. He has taken sides with the persecuted, for which we honor him. To do such a thing, he took his life into his own hands. He successfully evaded your soldiers. He resented insults as any man has the right to do." "What would you do?" "A complete pardon, here and now, for this man, known as Senor Zorro." "Never!" the governor cried. "He has affronted me personally. He shall die the death. He turned around and saw Don Alejandro Vega standing near him. Don Alejandro, you are the most influential man in this country, he said. You are the one man against whom even the governor dare not stand. You're a man of justice. Tell these young caballeros that what they wish cannot be granted. Bid them retire to their homes, and this show of treason will be forgotten. I stand behind them, Don Alejandro thundered. You stand behind them? I do, Your Excellency. I echo every word they have spoken in your presence. Prosecution must cease. Grant their requests. See that your officials do right hereafter. Return to San Francisco de Asís. And I take my oath that there shall be no treason in the Southland. I shall see to it myself, but oppose them, Excellency, and I shall take sides against you, see you driven from office and ruined, and your foul parasites with you. This terrible, willful Southland, the governor cried. Your answer, Don Alejandro demanded. I can do nothing but agree, the governor said, but there is one thing. Well, I spare the man's life if he surrenders, but he must stand trial for the murder of Captain Ramon. Murder? Queried the leader of the caballeros. It was a duel between two gentlemen, Excellency. Senor Zorro resented an insult on the part of the comandante to the senorita. Ha, but Ramon was a caballero. And so is this Senor Zorro. He told us as much, and we believe him, for there was no falsehood in his voice. So it was a duel, Excellency, and between gentlemen. According to the code, the Captain Ramon was unfortunate that he was not a better man with the blade. That is understood. Now, your answer. I agree, the governor said weakly. I pardon him, and I go home to San Francisco de Asís, and persecution ceases in this locality, but I hold Don Alejandro to his promise that there be no treason against me here if I do these things. I have given my word, Don Alejandro said. The caballeros shrieked their happiness and dismounted. They drove the soldiers away from the door, Sergeant Gonzalez growling into his mustache because here was a reward gone glimmering again. Within there, Senor Zorro, one cried. You have heard? I have heard, caballero. Open the door and come out amongst us, a free man. There was a moment's hesitation, and then the battered door was unbarred and opened, and Senor Zorro stepped out with the senorita on his arm. He stopped just in front of the door, removed his sombrero, and bowed low before them. A good day to you, caballeros, he cried. Sergeant, I regret that you have missed the reward, but I shall see the amount is placed to the credit of you and your men with the landlord of the tavern. By the saints, he is a caballero, Gonzalez cried. Unmask, man, cried the governor. I would see the features of the person who has fooled my troopers and gained caballeros to his banner and forced me to make a compromise. I fear that you will be disappointed when you see my poor features, Senor Zorro replied. Do you expect me to look like Satan? Or can it be possible, on the other hand, that you believe I have an angelic countenance? He chuckled, glanced down at the Senorita Lolita, and then put up a hand and tore off his mask. A chorus of gasps answered with the motion and explosive oath or two from the soldiers, and cries of delight from the caballeros, and a screech of mingled pride and joy from one old hidalgo. Don Diego, my son, my son! And the man before them seemed to droop suddenly in the shoulders and sighed and spoke in a languid voice. These be turbulent times. Can a man never meditate on music and the poets? And Don Diego Vega, the curse of Capistrano, was clasped for a moment in his father's arms. They crowded forward, troopers, natives, caballeros, surrounding Don Diego Vega and the senorita, who clutched at his arm and looked up at him from proud and glistening eyes. Explain, explain, they cried. It began about 10 years ago. When I was about a lad of 15, he said, I heard tales of persecution. I saw my friends, the frailes, annoyed and robbed. I saw soldiers beat an old native who was my friend, and I was determined to play this game. It'd be a difficult game to play, I knew, so I pretended to have small interest in life so that men would never connect my name with that of a highwayman that I expected to become. In secret, I practiced horsemanship and learned how to handle a blade. By the saints, he did, Sergeant Gonzalez growled. One half of me was languid Don Diego, you all knew. The other half was the curse of Capistrano I hoped one day to be. And then the time came and my work began. It is a peculiar thing to explain, senores. The moment I donned the cloak and mask, the Don Diego part of me fell away, my body straightened, new blood seemed to course through my veins, my voice grew strong and firm, fire came to me. And the moment I removed cloak and mask, I was the languid Don Diego again. It is not a peculiar thing. I had made friends with this great Sergeant Gonzalez, and for a purpose. Ha! I guess the purpose, caballeros, Gonzalez cried. You tired whenever you saw this Senor Zorro was mentioned, and did not wish to hear of violence and bloodshed, but always you asked me in what direction I was going with my troopers, and you went in the other direction and did your confounded work. You're an excellent guesser, said Don Diego, laughing, as did the others about him. I even crossed blades with you, so you would not guess I was Senor Zorro. You remember the rainy night in the tavern? I listened to your boasts, went out, donned the mask and cloak, came in and fought you, escaped, took off the mask and cloak, and returned to jest with you. Ha! I visited the Puledo Hacienda as Don Diego, and a short time later returned as Senor Zorro, and held speech with the senorita there. You almost had me, Sergeant, that night at Fray Felipe's, the first night, I mean. Ha! You told me that you had not seen Senor Zorro. Nor had I. The Fray does not keep a mirror, thinking that it makes for vanity. The other things were not difficult, of course. You can easily understand how. As Senor Zorro, I happened to be at my own house in the town when the Comandante insulted the senorita. And the senorita must forgive me the deception. I courted her as Don Diego, and she would not have none of me. Then I tried it as Senor Zorro, and the saints were kind, and she gave me her love. Perhaps there was some method in that also, for she turned from the wealth of Don Diego Vega to the man she loved, though she deemed him then an outcast and an outlaw. She has shown me her true heart, and I am rejoiced at it. Your Excellency, this senorita is to become my wife, and I take it you will think twice before you will annoy her family further. His Excellency threw out his hands in a gesture of resignation. It was difficult to fool you all, but it has been done, Don Diego continued. Only years of practice allowed me to accomplish it. And now Senor Zorro shall ride no more, for there will be no need, and moreover a married man should take some care of his life. And what man do I wed? The senorita Lolita asked, blushing because she spoke the words where all could hear. What man do you love? I had fancied that I loved Senor Zorro, but it comes to me now that I love both of them, she said. Is it not shameless? But I would rather have you, Senor Zorro, than the old Don Diego I knew. We shall endeavor to establish a golden mean, he replied, laughing again. I shall drop the old languid ways and change gradually into the man you would have me. People will say that marriage made a man of me. He stooped and kissed her there before all. Oh, meal mushing goat's milk, swore Sergeant Gonzalez. And thus began the wonderful life for Don Diego Vega and the lovely Senorita Lolita. And the end of the ride for the curse of the Capistrano, Zorro. Unless, of course, he is needed again.